Welcome. I appreciate you coming out at 8 o'clock in the morning for what may be seem like a fairly, it's not a super sexy topic, I guess, but it's a very important one. So Eric asked me to give a little bit of a bio. I'm my least favorite subject to talk about, so I'll make it quick. I am Jason Peterson. I work for Derry Township School District, which you're sitting in the middle of. So you're welcome to Hershey, everybody. Hopefully you're having a great time. If you need restaurant recommendations, see me after. I can tell you where good places to go, so you don't have to go to all the chain places. I've been a school psychologist for 25 years. Worked for the IU13 for 3 years. Worked for Cornwall Lebanon School District for about 7, and have been the last 15 or so at Derry Township School District. Originally from Western PA. Anybody from Western PA? Anybody know where Jeanette is? I'm a Jeanette boy. That's where I grew up. So yeah, so I've been out here for quite a while. Got my doctorate up at Penn State University. So should I shout "We are" to see if anybody shouts back? Feel free. We are, if you want. No. So yeah, so we're going to dive right in. And as I said, the title is "Data Doesn't Lie, Do We?" And the reason I chose that is because when we're talking about disproportionality in any form or fashion, typically what happens is people like to try to explain away the data, as opposed to confronting it and being okay with it and saying, okay, this is really information we need to act upon, not information we should try to shunt away. So I chose that topic and that title in particular because it's an easy thing to do. There's always a reason for why something happened, and it's not necessarily what it is. So you have to be honest about the data and let it sit with you. Full disclosure, I will be referencing different things throughout this presentation that are based on a book that I co-authored from a couple of years ago. Called The Data-Driven School. Also a shameless plug, so if you feel like picking up a copy wouldn't break my heart. It actually, aside from that, I get very little from it actually, but it's a really good tool. If you're looking to think about how you're going to implement any kind of data-driven processes like MTSS, et cetera, for academics or behavior, it's a pretty well laid out guide for doing that. Wow, we're having fun next door. Sorry, I'll try to be more entertaining. So we'll be walking through examples of how to do this. Ironically enough, as Erica was sharing about the Wi-Fi access, I'm probably the only person in the room who can't actually access the Wi-Fi. My laptop will not connect. So there's this. Thankfully, I have screenshots of what I wanted to show you, but the Google Sheet would have been much more interesting, I think. But who knows? Maybe we'll catch a break and I'll be able to connect in a little bit. So, starting with this quote. Because I thought it was fairly appropriate for what we do in education, because it's, the unexamined life is not worth living. How often in education do we collect, how much data do you collect in your schools on the regular basis, on the regular, I'm going to try to be hip, on the regular, and nobody bothers to look at it or deal with it or do anything with it? For those of you of my vintage, things used to be in binders. You would get binders of data from like, oh, we did all this stuff, and now here's the binder worth of data. And oftentimes you'd see the uneven table being propped up using the binder of data because nobody actually looked at it. They just put it on a shelf and gathered dust. We do that constantly in education, where one of our major flaws is we like to do things and then not bother to check to see if it actually worked or not. We just assume that it has. And so I'm advocating sort of globally that you have data for a reason. It's not scary. It's something you should be using to inform your practice and help you to do better, because frankly our kids don't have time for us to waste by doing things that are ineffective or not engaging in practice as appropriate. And frankly, you didn't get an education to feel frustrated constantly, I'm assuming. So you'd like to know if what you're doing is working and how you can make things better, and the data is a great way to do that. And plus, I'm a big fan of prevention, not being reactive. I love playing whack-a-mole at Hershey Park. I don't like doing it in my job. It's my least favorite. How many people feel like you're in a reactive stance constantly in your schools? Yeah. Absolutely. So hopefully what you take from this is you don't have to be reactive. Your data can help you to say, oh, this is what's happening, this is why it's happening, and get ahead of it and start being proactive about addressing issues that come up, rather than waiting to be overwhelmed by them. There's often that was the phrase I heard once, the tyranny of the immediate. As everybody thinks that everything's a crisis right now, I got news for you. There's a very wise school psychologist that I've known for years who said there is no such thing as an educational emergency. And let that marinate for a moment. Is anybody bleeding out if they didn't do well on, a particular assessment? No, we have time to be thoughtful, and we should take the time to be thoughtful and use that information. It's not like it's a rush. So think about what you can do and how you can use your data to be more proactive and get ahead of the problems before they get too entrenched. And I'm going to use a quick example. How many of you remember the math PSSAs from 2016 and what happened? How many of you were great in math in 2015 on the PSSAs, and in 2016, all of a sudden you weren't? Right. Yeah. And I bring that up as an example because it's a great way to use data to understand the problems that happen. So for those of you who don't recall, or maybe weren't paying attention to it at the time, and in 2015, everybody was crushing it across Pennsylvania on the math PSSAs. I mean, we're like 95% advanced proficient on PSSAs, and we're like, woohoo, we rock. And then 2016, all of a sudden, we were like 70%, 75% proficient. And everybody's like, oh my gosh, what happened? We got to have a talk with the math department. We got to, have all this consternation. And it was not unique to us. It was across Pennsylvania. And people were really upset, and they were like trying to scrap what they were doing in math, buying new programs, being upset with their math teachers, everything, all of this stuff, all these really knee-jerk reactions to the problem that all of a sudden now you were doing poorly in math. Does anybody know what happened and why that happened? There were two things that took place. One, 2016 was the first time the PSSAs were based on the Common Core. So the test was significantly more challenging. And the other thing was, they raised the cut score for proficiency significantly. Prior to that, so there are two things. So 2015, the test was easier, and the cut score, for those of you who don't know, was set at the 25th percentile. Do you know what it was in 2016 and has remained since? In third grade, it's set at the 51st percentile. And it gets progressively higher up. The 8th grade is almost the 70th percentile. So not only did the test become significantly harder year over year, the ability to achieve proficiency became significantly more challenging. So that's why everybody's scores dropped and plummeted. It wasn't because all of a sudden all the students forgot how to do math, or that the teachers suddenly became terrible. It was variables changed. Something changed in the environment that you needed, so you had to use the data to figure out what that is. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that if you use the data and have an understanding of how these things work and be able to ask these questions, you can be more intentional in your decision making. Because that was the thing, because our administration, like every administration, wanted to burn the place down and start over. And I was like, wait, this is too weird. This just doesn't happen. So we had a conversation and then had a reasoned response to it and altered some things in a reasonable way, in an intentional way. So that's what I'm advocating for, is that you can use this data to be able to do that. For those of you unfamiliar with the problem identification process, is kind of going to go through this today, where you identify what the problem is, you analyze it, you come up with a plan, you implement that plan, then you evaluate it and revise. So it's a rinse and repeat kind of a process. So, thinking about your special education data, and we're going to talk more broadly about lots of different data, but we'll talk about that. Does anybody have a current process where they're actually examining whether they're significantly disproportionate or not? Does anybody know whether you're significantly, okay, you have one.
I'm not sure if we specifically focus on the disproportionality, but we have weekly MTSS meetings that are elementary school and then bi-weekly at our high school level. So we're looking to see, where all the students are laying out, and then so we're not exactly examining the disproportionality, but we are looking, to see where that over-identification is coming from.
Okay, excellent. Does that? I won't get back. Somebody else has their hand. Go ahead.
Are looking strategically, intentionally.
Yeah, by the way, if you don't know, Kelly's going to bring the mic around so that way they can hear you on the recording.
Good morning. For the last 2 years, our district has brought in a professional or expert to look at our data and disproportionality just based on.
Yes. Right, because you will, yes, for those of you, and you may not know this, and that might be a good thing at this point, because it means you perhaps haven't been cited, but the state is looking at your disproportionality data in terms of special education to see if you're not. And it's a 3-year rolling average, so if over the course of 3 years you're showing that the pattern persists, then you're going to get cited, and they'll ask you to engage in corrective action. What I'm suggesting is, today in this process, is that you not wait to get cited by the state. That's a lousy way to find out there's a problem, right? And then your hands are really tied, and your students have suffered all along. So there's a way to get ahead of that. because I would wonder in your MTSS meetings, are you looking at these demographic variables? Because there's a lot of multiple measures that funnel into the decision making about this, what is and is not important information that you have, and we should be thinking about that. You'll have the graphic and all that. So one of the things you need to be thinking about is your core program effective for everyone? And my question would be is how do you know whether it is or not? I mean, a real quick and dirty example I'll give you is, the PSSAs. People may not love them, but they're measures of the standards. And if you're teaching kids to read and do math, they should be able to do okay on the PSSAs. And the question I would ask is, if your school is 60% effective, and you don't have to raise your hands, I'm not asking for that, would you send your child to a school that was just 60% effective? And how often in education are we patting ourselves on the back for that? Saying, oh yeah, we hit 60, we're at 65, way to go us. Would you send your child to a school that was only 60 to 65% effective in its programming? If not, you need to be thinking about why that is, what's going on with your core program, and who's being left out. Who's being left out? Are your interventions working? Who's in need support? Does your disproportionality exist in discipline, referrals to special education, and identification? I would say, looking at your MTSS system, we have a very high-functioning MTSS system. We still have people who this is where they try to ignore the data and still funnel more kids based on demographic variables into more support. So that's what I'm saying, you have to be careful. This is a process that you have to be very mindful of, because people will come up with lots of really wonderful explanations why child X is more in need than child Y when their data looks exactly the same. So, and that's why you can end up with, that's one of the factors that leads to disproportionate identification for special education. See, if you load up that system, no matter what system you have, it's going to trickle through. So those of you unfamiliar, and you're welcome to go if you don't, you can access through the state your disproportionality dashboard. They call it the SIG-DISP, which is kind of a weird phrase to say, but the SIG-DISP, you can go in there and find that and look at your actual rolling averages for different demographic groups broken out by disability status. Another one you can look at, and like I said, if I could actually access the Wi-Fi, I'd click on them and show you, but that's not going to work this morning. Thankfully, I have screenshots, thinking ahead. There's lots of information that's publicly available too. So even if you can't, because this you might not be able to access, and I apologize to the cameraman because I'm doing what he told me not to do, that you need a password for, a login and a password. You may not have access to that, but somebody in your district does, and you may want to find out who that person is to find out, so that way you can start having this conversation. That's something you have to have access to with a password. These other two are publicly available. So you can start with the Penn data page. If you haven't done that, heck, you can do it right now if you want. Go look up your school to see, and it'll pull up a dashboard that tells you about your special education data for the last 15 years, and it'll break it out by disability categories compared to your district and state averages, as well as within your district your race ethnicity identification based on their representation in your population. So it gives you a very quick and dirty way to look at, are you disproportionate? You can get a sense of it right there. And then I have the ProPublica site up there, but the information is out of date because they haven't updated it in about 5 years. But honestly, I'd be willing to bet cash money that probably not radically different. So you can go and look to see whether there's opportunity gaps, as well as achievement gaps, as well as disproportionate discipline practices taking place in your schools. And you can drill down to individual schools. You can look at your district and go down to individual schools. So these are some strands of data that are publicly available that you can start accessing to start this conversation. So when you're looking at this, as I said, the SIG-DISP analyzes disability status based on the categories. And these are the specific ones that it looks at. Also looks at discipline and whether you're disproportionately disciplining students with disabilities, as well as students with disabilities who are also color or economically disadvantaged. So these are things to be looking at, and that breaks it down for you here a bit. This is definitely this is the ProPublica. So if you go in there, this is one I mentioned that you can check out and drill down. It has those indicators. It has achievement gap, segregation index, and discipline issues, and tells you whether you're disproportionate there. I'm also going to show you, and I said if the Wi-Fi were working, I'd show you it more dynamically, but you can do this analysis without having to do this, because I know sometimes we have folks who say, I really want to know about our data. I want to trust our analysis, not somebody from outside, because this is obviously all pulling from publicly available data. And then we'll go through the process for how you do that in-house. So that way you don't have to wait, so you don't have that lag time. You can know in real time how things are going. One of the things we started doing is we started calculating discipline disproportionality on a monthly basis, just to see if there were trends, so that way we could see what that pattern looked like. Spoiler alert, we were disproportionate. As I would be willing to bet most of you are, if not all of you. And I don't say that to be overly critical, it's true. It's true of how we practice. And that's something that we need to be mindful of, which is why I'm thrilled that so many people are here and that we can have this conversation, because it's one that's long overdue and we need to be having on a more regular basis and be unafraid to. Because I can remember starting this conversation in like 2014 and having people go, shh, we're going to the conference room. Don't tell anybody why we're going here. Nobody wants to be called racist. It's like, it's not about being racist. It's about finding out what your practices are and being willing to change it and having that conversation. Is it a difficult and uncomfortable conversation? Yeah, it is. And it needs to happen. We have kids that are struggling. Education is education for all. That's why it's called public education. It's for everybody. We got to raise everybody up. We can't just say, we'll raise you up. Sorry. We need to make sure we're raising everybody up. And having these conversations allows us to do that. So this is Derry Township, because if we're going to talk about this, I'm not going to be hiding behind and say, oh no, it's not me. This is us. So you can take a look at some of our data. This is pulled down from the PA Future Ready Index. Also a great place to find information, to look at what your practices look like and how you're performing and who's underperforming. So all of these are publicly available. So even if you can't get access to the SIG-DISP, you can start pulling this data together to put the puzzle together to figure out what's truly going on with your district. This is Pennsylvania's statewide data from this is from the ProPublica database, and I need my glasses because I can't see it anymore. So if you look, you can see that the composition which is up here, of the entire state, this was from 2018, the composition of the representation in AP courses based on race, ethnicity. Anybody notice anything? So we're talking a little bit about under and over representation. Some underrepresentation there. Gifted, talented. Some underrepresentation and overrepresentation there. Because what you're doing is, just as a quick aside, is this is the Pennsylvania composition, so you should be comparing these percentages to these percentages. They should roughly line up, right? More or less. I mean, you'll have a little variability there, but they pretty much should be lining up. Are they? No, they are not. Out-of-school suspensions. 15% of the population, students are black. 43% of the out-of-school suspensions are children who are black. Expulsions, 34%. Hispanic, Latino. It's pretty damning if you look at it. And that's the point, is you need to be having these conversations. So you can be doing the comparison to your general population, your student body population, and look at each one of these through either ProPublica or on your own to say, are we significantly disproportionate? And then what does it look like in special ed? What does it look like in special ed? So here's a little bit more from ProPublica. And this is the Penn data. So if you haven't been to the site, when we go through that, making sure I'm keeping track of time, because I'm actually talking pretty fast this morning. If I talk too fast, by the way, which I tend to do, let me know. If you have questions, by the way, I should have said this at the outset, don't hesitate. If you want to ask questions, you want to argue, whatever, I'm fine with anything. I'm good. We can do whatever. But I want you to feel like, I hate just to stand and talk at you. But once I get rolling, there's a significant likelihood I will do that. So interrupt me as we go. So this is the Penn data page. This is us. So this is, like I said, I'm not going to hide our data. It's publicly available, and it's something we need to have the conversation about. So as I was talking about, this is from a few years ago. And these are screenshots that I pulled. So you can see, there we go, come over here, follow the rules. This is our enrollment based on disabilities and special education compared to the state average. We have a very strong MTSS model. So if you look at our SLD, it's actually now down to 25% of our special education population are SLD. MTSS works. Spoiler alert, in case you didn't know and you're not doing it, feel free. We can talk about that another time. You can call me. But it really works. It's very effective. But this is the other part that I want to talk a little bit more about in terms of disproportionality, which is, here's our LEA, and these are the race ethnicities in special education. Notice anything? And I think if I remember correctly, I was really cool when I put it in graphics. So what do you notice? Very simple calculation, right? 5.3 of the population at that time in our LEA, our students are black African American. 8.2 are in special education, are represented in special education, 8.2% of our special education population. And it's actually shifted slightly. In the Hispanic Latino, if you look at that, that's actually worse, right? 8.3% of our total population are Hispanic and Latino. 15% are in special education. Of special education population, 50% are Hispanic Latino. 2 times. And we have a pretty good MPSS system. And yet, which is data-based, data-driven, and yet. Yeah, thank you. Wow, see, somebody actually took me up on it. Hold on, you got to wait for the microphone. Otherwise, I have to try to repeat it, which will not go well.
I'm curious about the Hispanic population. Does that have anything to do with the ELs?
Nope.
Because
Sadly,
I
nope.
would say, unfortunately, I feel like I see a lot of over-identification of our ELs being referred to special ed.
Right, now that's actually something we're pretty good at, is we're very clear about, no, we got to pump the brakes just because they can't speak English and they can't learn it, or they can't, they can't do English, we're not saying they're disabled. Learning another language is not disabled. If that were the case, I'm the most disabled person you've ever met, because I was not very good at learning a second language. So why would we try to penalize our students? So it's not EL. That's a good question. Didn't even touch on that, but it's not the EL population. And if you're thinking of referring, and I know that with the EL population, it's actually kind of interesting, because I think oftentimes out of the kindness of people's hearts, they end up thinking they're doing the kids a favor by referring them to special education because they need help, because they're struggling. So we need to put them in special education and say they are disabled. Anybody here fluent in another language? Are you all disabled then? Exactly. But we seem to lose that thinking when we're talking about children. And like I said, I'd like to think, and this is the optimist in me, I'd like to think it's coming from a good place. We need to get them help. We don't have other ways to get them help. We see they're struggling, so we want to do something for them. Calling a child disabled is not helping them. There are other ways to find that you can support them, but saying disabled is not one of them. So no, sadly it is not. It is just that. So we actually got tagged, and it's funny because I did this presentation, a variation on this theme a couple of years ago at a data leadership assembly here at Hershey Lodge, like 3 years ago on this topic because I was passionate about it and very interested in it. Unbeknownst to me, because it hadn't come out yet, we were tagged for being significantly disproportionate in our identification of students who were black as in SLD. No idea, blissfully ignorant. I'm talking about how bad it looks, and it turns out, yeah, it was worse than I even thought. So then what happens then? So you get tagged by the state. What do? Do you just wring your hands? Or do you try to figure out why it's happening? Try to figure out why. I know one of the things that we talked about and we determined, and we figured out was, as I said earlier, and I kind of spoiled my own example, is that when we have our data meetings, we would have people say, this student is really struggling, and this student is really struggling, but this student is struggling more. Well, why is this student struggling more? Well, the family's not as supportive. Where do they come from? Blah, blah, blah. They don't have this, they don't have that. Do you want to know what the main difference is between those kids? Anybody want to take a guess? Race. Everything about them is the same. Socioeconomic status, everything's the same. The only variable that is different is this child is either black or brown. So they're perceived, their data is interpreted as being more problematic than this child's data, who is white. And I know you think, oh, he's just being dramatic. I'm not being dramatic. If you'll stop, look around, and really listen to people, I'm sure you will see that pattern happening. So the question is do you have the guts to say something? And that's what we had to do. We had to have those difficult conversations. We didn't call people out like, oh, you're a racist. We didn't do that, but we're like, hey, no, I understand what you're saying. However, we go by the data. And that's what we're doing. So if you're saying that both of these kids are at risk, then they both get moved on. But we don't move one forward differentially than the other just because of demographics. And that's an important piece. So when we dug in, we're like, okay, so one of the things we started doing at our MTSS meetings is we started taking the names off all the data for the meetings. So that way you couldn't say, oh, this is so-and-so. I know they're worse off than this kid. All you had was the data. We also assigned, to the school psychs, the job of being what we call the process observer, which I'm stealing from later slides, which is the person to say, to pump the brakes and go, help me understand why this child's more at risk. Just checking. You know, I'm just concerned. Because, and frankly, what we also found is we found there were specific teachers, and I hate to say it, we did. We found there were specific teachers who tended to over-refer kids of color. They were always the most at-risk kids in their classes. So, you want to talk about how you end up being disproportionate in special ed? The referral process is a major cause of that. I've even touched on, when we talked earlier about the core program and whether that's actually working for everybody and whether kids are having the same experience in the core program or not. Because, make no mistake, how many of you have heard of the Pygmalion effect? Anybody? Yeah. Maybe in your intro psych classes in undergrad, they talked about the Pygmalion effect. For those of you who may have forgotten, the study essentially was about how they told teachers, we have tested all the children's IQ. And this group are really low functioning. This group is really high functioning. Here's this trick. Kids were randomly assigned, so it was not true. But what happened was, at the end of the year, this group significantly outperformed this group. Why? Because the teacher's perception of them was different. The teacher assumed they couldn't, so did lots of things subtly and unconsciously. I'm not saying they were doing it on purpose. Unconsciously engaged in practices that fulfilled the prophecy that these students were underperformers. And the same for this group, fulfilled the prophecy that they were really high functioning would be great. So if you need any more evidence about how your perceptions of people and how your thoughts about them differentially impact how you interact with them, go back and reread all those studies because it was replicated over and over and over again that show that your perception, and if you look at some of Hattie's work, there's a little bit of that sort of folded in there. If I perceive and assume that you can do well, if that's my base assumption, you will. And if I assume you can't, you won't. So that's what we're dealing with here. So we had to have that conversation and say, there may be things you're doing that are ending up this way, that are causing students to end up with these outcomes. Yeah, thanks.
Quick question.
Yeah.
I don't need the mic because I can talk really.
We need it for
The recording. It's not that I can't hear you. I'm not that old. I can hear you. It's for the recording. Jeez.
All right. Yeah, I hate microphones because my voice is always so loud.
Okay, here we go.
All right, thank you.
You're right.
My quick question is, so especially like what you guys at Dairy Teacher, what do you guys do when you have the data that supports that this kid needs to be tested in the special ed and the parents are so adamantly against it? Because we have a couple of them at the school I teach at, and it's just like, it's like the highest this kid needs, and the data is backing it up, and how much this student needs, but the parents are too, I don't like to use the word ignorant, but I'm using the word ignorant because they are ignorant, to realize that my child needs help. And
yeah, interesting question. I mean, we don't often have the problem that people are saying no. We have the problem that people want more. So it's typically the case. But I mean, honestly, that's a conversation we have a lot. I don't know, do you have an MTSS system in place?
yes, we do. Yeah.
So I would assume they're familiar with the idea that everything you're doing is trying to be supportive.
Correct.
So that's where we are the ones that go to them and say, look, the data supports this. And all you can do, honestly, is at that point to say, we have a lot of concerns. This is what the data is showing us. They're really showing us at risk. We want to provide this additional support.
Right.
You issue that permission to evaluate. They have the right to say no.
Right. That's what we do. But it's just like it's just constant, like, because I feel like parents see it as like, oh, my child is bad or my child is.
Well.
And it's just, I didn't know if like, because
I don't have any magic for that other than forming a relationship with them, because very often parents, I would say a lot of parents, first of all, fundamentally don't understand special education, the process and what it means and what it entails. And it's not a small thing to say a child has a disability.
Right.
So that's a little bit off-putting. And frankly, my question is what was that parent's experience in school themselves? Because for a lot of parents, school's not their favorite place. Right. They had a really bad experience, and now all of a sudden you're telling them their child is problematic, there's something wrong with their child, is how it feels. So it's trying to develop that empathy and make those connections with them to say, look, and that for us, it's always like we try to go that extra mile to really demonstrate what we're trying to do to support your child, and say we get to a point where, hey, we've tried X, Y, Z, we've done all of this. What we're finding is their rate of learning is different, and we just need to find a different way to support them, which means we can provide these additional protections and supports. This is what it means for your child. And that's what I would say, is it's all about having that relationship with them and recognizing that, and sometimes I'm not the one that should be having that conversation.
Right.
It might not be me as a school psychologist. It might be a teacher or administrator.
Right.
It might be a speech therapist. It might be anybody who has a good relationship with that family. That's all you can do. Yeah, there is no magic for that other than it's because oftentimes, and this is a whole different presentation I can do on whether people feel like they belong in school, students and families.
Right.
And they don't often feel like this is a place where they belong. It's a scary place. And frankly, if the only time they've ever heard from you is when there's a problem with their child, frankly, I don't blame them.
Exactly.
I wouldn't be like overly thrilled. I wouldn't be, and they're not trusting.
Right.
So it's how do you rebuild that trust, and it might take a little time. Yeah, I wish I had something better than that.
I know that the thing about what like looking at their family in school, that actually works out. This is my first year as the emotional support teacher at Pine Grove. So but our guidance counselor has been there for 25 years. So she couldn't track back to see, because I don't know if the child's family went to Pine Grove or not. So I'm gonna actually I'm gonna look into that next week.
Well, and it's not even relevant whether it was your school specific that they went to. It's whether their school experience in general was not great. And frankly, that it's how do you make it less intimidating? The worst thing you can do, I mean, like right now, here I am standing in front of all of you. Now imagine this is you. I'm a parent, and you said, "Hey, Jace, come on in. We want to talk to you about how your child's not doing well." And I walk in, and this is what it feels like if it's a room of even like 5 people.
Right.
For a parent, because you're talking in an entirely different, essentially, language than they are familiar with. And all these different, and shorthands, and everybody who's like kind of knows what's going on, except for the person that has to make a decision that you're asking to do this big thing.
Right.
It's kind of a scary process.
Right.
So it's how do you help them to be comfortable, and it might not be like this type of environment. One person maybe say, "Hey, can I just have a conversation with you? Can we set up a time?
Right.
I just want to touch base. You know, I've been noticing this, and I think we want to try to support." So.
All right. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. Okay, so deeping dive. So when we were talking about, as I said, our SLD population, we were finding we were tagged for being significantly disproportionate. So the question was, okay, and you know, there are only 3 school psychologists in Derry Township, so we actually sat there and we kind of scratched our heads for a minute going, I really don't remember identifying that many kids. But so we sat down and we started looking at the data a little deeper to say, what's going on? And because, of course, you know, everybody's always looking for that, how do you explain things away? Because people are like, oh, they weren't ours. So we said, right, well, let's just look to see. Because everybody's like, they all moved in. All the students that caused this problem moved in. So we looked at it and it was like, well, that's not exactly the case. It was about, I mean, when we started looking at it, we were finding that a portion of the population had moved in. There were kids already identified as being with specific learning disabilities who moved in, who either were black or Hispanic. And frankly, we were we're like, at some point we're going to get tagged for that because that's much higher. And so we started looking a little deeper and said, all right, if you break it down, what does it actually look like? Who did we identify versus who did we inherit? And it worked out to be roughly 50-50. It's like we did identify some of the students, about half the students, and about half the students moved in. So what we found was, yeah, it's not as bad, it's still bad. So it's still partially our practices, our system, that are resulting in that. It doesn't account for everybody, but it accounts for about half of those students. And when we looked at actually ran the numbers to see, it's like, okay, we're only slightly discrepant and slightly disproportionate then. So that's when we really said, we need to be doing something different. We need to be changing our practices. Yes. Oh, wait, hold on. You got to get the microphone. Oh, right over there. Poor Kelly. Every time she thinks she's good where she is.
Are you keeping data on disproportionality and when students are identifying their 3-year reevaluation, how you correct that disproportionality?
That's an interesting question. Now, we hadn't specifically looked at that when they come due for the reevals to say, is this somebody who could be exited. We haven't intentionally done that. That's where we're trying to let the data, the actual student performance data, guide that. To say who are students that are ready to be exited. We did have a student that had been identified that moved in at the end of first grade. And when we looked at the information, we're like, not sure why this kid has special education, period. So we actually decided in the middle of second grade, because we wanted to give the child a chance to be there, the parent to get comfortable with us, and et cetera, because you didn't want to say, hey, you're brand new to us. By the way, we don't think your kid needs special education. We've known them for 5 days. They need to get out. So we gave it to mid-year, and then because once we built a relationship with the family and that trust, and said, you know what, your student's doing pretty well. We really want to look at reevaluating to see if they need special education anymore. So we have exited some students that way. We have had students move in from out of state. Same sort of thing, is because when you do that, for those of you who don't know, when a child moves in from out of state with an IEP, Pennsylvania, you have to do an initial evaluation, which is oftentimes just a record view to say, do they still qualify or not? We've used that as an opportunity, because you're looking at going, I don't even know how they identify the child in the first place. But we'll find a way, we'll look to exit. And again, try to build that relationship and have a lot of contact with that family when that's your suspicion, so that way it's not feeling like it's coming out of the blue for them. And we try to frame it as a celebration. Like, hey, this was great. Where you came from did really worked. Which I wanted to say, which was that your child wasn't disabled in the first place, but that's beside the point. But really it didn't work. It's been working, so we try to move them out. But we are through the reevaluation process trying to correct it, but we haven't specifically collected that data. That's a good idea. Thank you for the suggestion. But yeah, so we're looking at it and saying, where did they come from? So we realized it was us. It was still partly our process. And I put this in because it was a study that a colleague and I had done years ago, looking at to drive the point home about how these variables impact, although the Pygmalion kind of does it, which was, the study we did was we sent out scenarios to 200 and some school psychologists across Pennsylvania. And we gave them the exact same vignettes describing a student and said, would you identify the student as being emotionally disturbed or not? There were 2 vignettes. Depending on what one you got was just all this data, and the other one was all this data plus a psychiatric diagnosis. That was it. You know, I like to think school psychs are kind of cool, and we rock it. No, our decision making was just as bad. People were overly weighted a psychiatric diagnosis in the process. Didn't matter what was going on in the classroom. If you had a psychiatric diagnosis, yep, you should be identified as being ED. So it happens. So that's what we're talking about, is these biases creep in, these decision-making patterns creep in, you differentially weight data and information. You need to be thoughtful about that. So you need to put in safeguards to do that, because we can't be trusted. So we have to be reflecting on our decision-making processes, and how do we make sure that we're doing something that prevents that from happening in the first place? Do you have specific decision rules? And I don't mean lockstep, like you can't deviate, because that never works. If you're an MTSS system where you're saying, student gets involved in Tier 1, now they're in Tier 2 for 6 weeks, and now they're in Tier 3 for 6 weeks, and now they go to special ed, I'll just tell you right now, you're doing it wrong. And we can talk about that all day long, and later we can have that argument and conversation, but you're doing it wrong. You need to let the data guide you. But you need to have decision rules. What are the thresholds? What are the things we're considering? What is the process we use? How do you shut down the conversations that are irrelevant? We posted lines of inquiry saying, these are the things we're going to be talking about today. When we come in to talk about reading, we're going to talk about phonemic awareness. We're going to talk about phonics. We're going to talk about decoding skills. We're not talking about whether the dad's a drinker. We're not talking about whether the family doesn't support them the way you think they should. We're not talking about, oh, I had their older brother, and their older brother can't do X. We're not talking about all that irrelevant stuff. We're talking about variables that are alterable, things we can control, not inalterable things. So that's something you fold into that process. How do you make sure that and it's not done in a nasty way. It's done in we need to be efficient in our use of time. We want to make this really work for you. So we are going to use a process that is focused on the data, focused on the information, to make sure that we're actually talking about things that we have a chance of controlling. Can you change a child's financial circumstances? No, me either. I tried playing the Powerball, hasn't worked out yet. I'd be happy to make donations. But otherwise, no. So I can spend all day lamenting it, but it doesn't matter. I can't do anything about it. What I can do is I can teach them better. That I can do. I can intervene better, right? Those are the things we have controls over. Those are the things we have control over, excuse me. All right, so as we're looking at this, sorry, I'm going to put all this stuff up at once. As you're thinking about where your data comes from and how you do this, you have student information management systems. Some are better than others. Some things do things better than others. Sorry, I'll step out of the way so you don't have me in your photo. But these are critical variables you want to capture. You know, you want to pull down from your SIS system. Sorry, of course. You want to know all the specific data and be able to use it to analyze. You want to be able to capture that information. It's available to you. Pull it down. Our new student information management system, actually, it's great because I have all these super groovy like Excel sheets I created to do all this stuff. It does it for us now. It does calculate disproportionality, so now I have more time on my hands. But it was like, I did all that work, and now I don't need to worry about it. But these are variables you should be considering. Capturing, pulling down all this information. Your academic data. As I said, when we're working through the process, this is some Acadians data we pulled, covering the kids' names. I didn't cover it for you guys. Well, I did, but you know, I also did it because that's how we present the data, without the numbers. We actually don't even use these reports. We pull them into a separate spreadsheet, and that's what we show. We show the data without, so that way it's sorted by, you can say, who's at risk. Pretty easy to figure out who they are, right? Does it matter what they look like? Does it matter whether their name ends with a vowel? No, it doesn't. It matters whether they can read or not. It matters whether they can do math or not. It matters whether they can follow the rules and be successful that way. Those are the things that matter. So that's the data we focus on. We don't focus on the things that you can't control. We talked a little bit about this, which is analyzing your referral rates, your eligibility rates, how many kids are referred, how many kids are referred by demographic variables. You should be asking these questions. It's uncomfortable to ask, but you should be asking them. People should be examining them to make sure that you are not being disproportionate. Spoiler alert, I'd be willing to bet you probably are. Do you know if you are? Anybody know if right now you're disproportionate with your special ed referral? Okay, couple. How many, the rest of you, and that's not, I'm not calling you out, I guess I kind of am, but not intentionally, not to be unkind, is do you even know? Or are you just assuming you're not? If you're only making assumptions, then you need to find the data to know. You need to find out who has the data and has that access. They're not going to necessarily want to have the conversation, I grant you that. Because, it's, as I said earlier, it's uncomfortable, but it's an important one to have. So you need to start asking the questions. Having the conversation. Be unafraid. The data doesn't lie, do we? We need to be unafraid of letting it guide us. Oh, we are disproportionate, so what do? I'll be honest. Fun story. Well, it might be fun, depending on your perspective. The first time we had been sharing a lot of the behavior data on a monthly basis at faculty meetings with staff. And all along, I had been running the analyses to see whether we were disproportionate in terms of our disciplinary practices. And after about 3 months of this, I said to the administrator, I'm like, hey, I'm already calculating this. Do you want to share it with the faculty so they can see what it looks like? And he's like, yeah, next faculty meeting, and we'll do that. I'm like, okay. Now we have a few interns and practicum students floating around. I'm like, hi. I said, do you guys want to come to this meeting? They're like, why? I said, trust me, you're going to want to come to this faculty meeting. Because usually faculty meetings are not the most riveting and engaging. So we did. And so I presented the typical data I had shown, and then I went to the next slide, which showed that we were disproportionate in terms of our disciplinary practices. How do you think that went over? Do you think everybody ran up and gave me high fives and hugs? It did not go like that. They weren't happy. There were a lot of people who were very visibly upset because when they saw that, what they assumed was I was saying they were racist. Right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is we all have biases. I have biases. You have biases. Everybody in the room does. We just can't act on them. And so I got the first thing was, you're saying we shouldn't be disciplining any kids of color. That's what you're saying, right? We should only be disciplining white kids. Like, no. I said, what I'm saying is what I've seen in the cafeteria, which is if you have 5 kids that are acting like boneheads, and one of them happens to be black, don't just send the black student to the office. Send all 5. That's equitable. They're all doing the wrong thing. So they all go, guess what? If you do that, we won't be disproportionate. But that's not what happens, folks. What happens is you send the kid that you have a bias against. Sorry, folks, that is how that works. And guess who doesn't feel like they belong? Those kids. Ask them. I'd be willing to bet. If you actually stopped and asked any of the kids that are chronically disciplined problems, school your place, Do you feel like anybody here cares about you? Do you feel like you belong here, like this is your spot? I would be willing to bet, a chocolate martini here at the lodge, their answer will be no. They don't feel connected to anybody there. This is not their place. Shame on us, right? It's for everybody. That's what publication is. Public education is for everybody. So as we're thinking about looking at our discipline data and our referral rates, we need to keep in mind that we do have biases. People don't like to talk about biases because it makes them feel like they're being judged. It's not about judging. We all have it. It's about doing something different. How do I raise your awareness to make sure that you're moving in the right direction? One of the things is you can look at your risk ratio. So pull this data back up. I did all these fancy risk ratio calculations. Now our student information management system does it, but now it does. So what this tells us is that students who are black are almost 2 times more likely to be identified for special education in our district. And frankly, it's a little worse for Hispanic kids. Look at your data. Like I said, if you need an entry point, this is your entry point right there to look at your special ed data. So Pennsylvania, as I said, they do the calculations for risk ratios. This is boring and dry. You can see it. You get the slides. I'm not going to run through it. I will say the one thing is you have to be cautious about the size, the number of students in a given cell. Like when you look at our data that I'll be showing a little bit later, you're going to see that it looks like we're wildly disproportionate with Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islanders. We only have 2 students in the building at the time when I read in the data. So yeah, the one kiddo happened to have a couple of issues. So it looks like we're wildly disproportionate in that. When the sample sizes for a given cell, for a given population group gets too small, that's where you have to go, okay, what are we doing here? So you're looking for a minimum of 10, et cetera, for the analyses. If you're thinking about action steps, things you can do, in case you aren't familiar with PDE's Equitable Practices Hub, here it is. And we have a celebrity in our midst. Dr. Nicole Holland Sims slipped in, and when she worked for PDE, she was very much involved in getting this launched. So you guys can take selfies with her later. I'm going to, so you should. So a lot of great resources there. Resources that are Pennsylvania specific and also resources that take you from around the nation for other good work that people are doing. So you have tools you can start looking at. A line of inquiry. Having that conversation. What are our data meetings about? How are we doing this? Who's determining who's appropriate for which level of support and why? What's going on there? Skip through some of this. Get into the discipline data. So some of the discipline data here, because this all feeds into, and one of the variables as you can see is special education status. That's an important piece. Are you disproportionately referring kids who are identified for special education? So discipline problems. Have you bothered to ask the question, or do you just wait for the manifestation meeting to roll around? That's something to know. Are you doing that? These are ways in which you can start digging in. So you start pulling down these variables. If your student information management system doesn't do it, Excel does. So what you do is you can pull down these critical variables. So I know years ago what I had to do is I talked to her, and every district is different in terms of who is the keeper of the keys for all these data management systems. So I just reached out to her. It turned out it was one of our IT people. And I said, I need a report that pulls down all of these variables into an Excel file. Because I had no idea how to do that in the system, because you have to know how to code. Not my jam. So she's like, oh, okay. So she created it for me and said, is this it? I'm like, yeah. So I had a report there, so I could literally log into our student information management system and find a report. It was kind of funny, because so she could remember what it was about. She named it Jason Peterson Discipline Data. I'm like, I'm not that bad of a kid, Like, I didn't do anything wrong. But it was, yeah, so that's what she was called. So she could remember what it was. And it actually made it easy, because then I could remember what it was. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's the one that has my name on it. Click, and it pulled all of this down. And then you can do the analyses, which is this. So, and remember what I said, I want to be able to access the internet to be able to show, well, this is what it is. So it is basically all of that data pulled down into an Excel file. And it populates over, so it has all the information. And one of the important bits of variables to include is their student ID number. And I'm going to tell you why in a minute. But that's an important variable to have there. Because when you're looking at the data, you want to make sure that you're not making the wrong attributions about a kid. We've had kids who have very unusual names, and somehow we have 4 of them. I'm like, how do we have 4 people that have the same first and last name that is just an unusual last name? So student ideas help to do that, because one of the things you want to look at is as you're pulling down your data, because this is now, this is the next page, and I really wish I could do the interactive portion, which is it takes all that data and then it does the calculation to the risk ratios. And one of the things we look at is we look at unique referrals. That's why your student ideas number is important, because you want to know, because this was the argument. Remember I shared that fun story about when I talked to the faculty and said, hey, here's the data. And everybody's like, you know, on pitchforks and torches and coming out, melting tar, plucking feathers, the whole 9 yards. One of the responses was, it's that kid. He's been referred 75 times this year. That's why we look so bad, because of him. Now, what they didn't know was I'd already run the analysis and controlled for unique referrals. So how many different kids actually were referred? Spoiler alert, the rates were the same. Even when you controlled for the fact that, yes, there was a student who had been referred like 75 times. When you control for that, using the unique ID, so you can see how many actual different students are referred, we're still disproportionate in every single way that we were. The magnitude might have shifted ever so slightly, but it was exactly the same. So if we were 3.5 times more likely to refer black children, when you look at just the overall numbers without controlling for the unique number of referrals, when we controlled for unique, we're about 3 times. Oh, okay. Well, it was an improvement, but still wildly disproportionate. So that's the point. So you can run these analyses, and I can share. And that's I think my email's at the end. And if you need, I can share with this and walk you through, because it's a pain in the butt to set up those Excel spreadsheets to begin with. But once you do, it really works. So all you need to know are you pull down that data, that raw data, into those columns, and then you just need to know how many total students fit into those. That green column, you need to know how many students are actually in your building, so you have a reference point, or for your district, depending on what level of calculation you can do. And then it looks at, and these are all conditionally formatted, so you can see when they're red, they're showing you that they're significantly disproportionate. What do you notice about the white kids in terms of discipline? Give you hints. This right here. It might be a little hard to see for those in the back. They're under-referred. For those of you who can't see in the back row, I'll help you out. They're under-referred. So you would expect, I mean, when you're looking at a ratio, you're expecting that, you know, about a 1-to-1 consistency. So if there are 70% of your population are students who are white, you'd expect pretty much about 70% of your referrals for discipline would probably be white kids, right? I mean, give or take a couple, there's be a little bit of variability there slightly, but you'd expect it roughly the same rates. What this shows is that's not the same rate. It's under. And actually at different years, it's significantly under. There was one year I ran the analysis, and this was like 70% of it was like less than 70%. A 0.7 of that. So it was significantly below what it would be. So they're actually at about a 60% referral rate. So you go, wow. So we're really under-referring the white kids, but and here's my Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander student, so you can ignore that one. It's really more this. Significantly disproportionate. And we're controlling for unique referrals, looking at that. So you're controlling for that information to say, what does it look like? So you can get ahead of this, and you can do this on a monthly basis. You don't have to wait to the year's end to try to change your practices and figure out what you can do differently. You can know right now what your patterns look like, how you're doing. Questions about this? This is a bit dry, and I know that, but it's also an important skill and information to have. Thoughts, questions, concerns, arguments? Nothing? How am I doing on time? Actually, I'm probably running ahead. So this is it broken out a little bit more easily seen. So you can see and this was just a random month I pulled. This is a month's worth of data, by the way. And I pulled it from like 2 years ago. I just pulled that up. And so this is what it looks like for those rates. And I actually found this. I was looking at the reference for it's in the references of this. But it was interesting. It was a little graphic to help you interpret the risk ratios. So if it's 1, you know, it's an equal risk. That's what you'd expect. 1.25, 25% higher risk, 50%, 2 times. My personal favorite is greater than 3. And if it's hard to see in the back, or what, the interpretation is yikes. So we have a couple of yikes, right? Uh-oh, that's a problem. So those are things to be thinking about and looking at. So, and you can calculate it, because one of the other, and I don't know that, No, it was supposed to be. I was going to show you in the demo, but one of the other calculations we do is we look at special ed status. What is the ratios for special ed status? I was hoping to be able to show you that so you could see it. So it calculates special ed status by race, ethnicity, by gender. So I do all the intersectionality. You can do all the intersectionality as well. So we can look at special ed status, socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, gender. Also, you can look at the type of referral. And I'm so bummed that's not, I wish we could get the internet. Because one of the things we look at is every discipline referral type is broken out by race, ethnicity. So you can see the types of behaviors that students are being referred for. And you can see whether there's a pattern there. Spoiler, there usually is. There usually is. So there's a pattern of certain students being referred for disrespect. By the way, why does anybody include disrespect as a category in a behavior management system? It drives me crazy. It's like the catch-all for everything. What does disrespect mean? Is this disrespect? Depends, right? Yeah, might be. Might be. I've seen a couple of you do it this morning. No, I didn't call you out on it, but no, yeah. But I mean, so yes, so that's the thing. So you can start looking at those patterns and say, well, what does it mean? So you said this was disrespect. What is that? What does it look like? Why is it the only kids who are getting tagged for disrespect happen to be children of color? Yes. Wait, go on. You got to wait for the. You got to wait for the microphone. Yeah, you're on.
My question is, so do you look for disproportionality with socioeconomic status? That's what you said something about that before,
Yep.
right? So wouldn't you expect some of those students to come up higher just because some of their, needs aren't being met at home in terms of like food? They might be dysregulated because of that lack of, meeting their basic needs.
It's possible, but what I don't do is make the assumption that it is a given. Just because you're a child of poverty doesn't mean that you're automatically problematic. And I think that's an important thing to think about, because it isn't a given. It is not a one-to-one correlation. It is not. There are many children who are children of poverty just fine. Couldn't pick them out of a lineup. You wouldn't know who they were.
So how do you look into that?
We use free and reduced lunch as the indicator. And that's the variable that we use. And that became tricky during COVID because they stopped doing that. So we have a black hole. I'm like, I don't know. Maybe, who knows? We can't look at that any longer because everybody's getting free food. So we don't know that anymore. But then as it's come back, and that's the one. That's actually the variable that's the hardest to get a hold of. You have to make sure you're very trustworthy, and excuse me, that you've made friends with the person who holds that information, and that they're willing to share it. And you say, yes, this will be locked down. No one else will see the names. All I need is to be able to associate, and then I will swear to God I will delete all the names. It'll be fine. Because otherwise that becomes problematic, and understandably so. They're trying to protect students' privacy. But that is the way we do that. So it is literally like one person you have to talk to, and then like one person gets the data and can do the calculation. Is generally how that works, because they want to make sure they're protecting privacy. There's another question in the back there. But it is important to know, because some of those variables might be, but it's not a given. And oftentimes they make assumptions about that. I know in Derry Township, just as an aside, when I started here, the poverty rate in Derry Township was 4%. It's now 27%. In 15 years. I'd like to think it's not my fault, but it has changed. But it was interesting, and I'll get you in one sec back there, when I talk about those alternate explanations people like to come up with to explain things away, that's been a big one. Oh, it's because our demographics have changed. The kids are poorer, that's why. That's why we're seeing, well, no, I mean, the patterns have existed, even when our demographics were 4%. The pattern is pretty consistent. We have to intentionally and actively change the process, and that's what we've been doing over years, is trying to do that. Yeah.
If we review the data and work with our staff on educating about bias and continually look at the data over and over again, and we still have disproportionality, what's a great next step to work on if we're not finding the results that we need, but you really feel like the teachers and staff members have reduced their bias?
Well, I would say it's a secondary piece of that is not just bias. It's also about how do they increase belonging. How do they increase, and I say it's not just not engaging in bias, but it's also how to make this, you feel like this is your space. And that's something, one of the things we embarked on for a number of different reasons, looking at all this data, COVID, et cetera, was we have embarked on a very intensive SEL program. But the first 2 years of the professional development, the work on this was professional development for staff to develop their SEL skills. Not focused on what you're going to do with the kids. How are you doing? How are you feeling? I sound like Joey from Friends. How are you doing? And so working on that. And one of the things we spent a lot of time hammering was self-awareness. And we did that intentionally because we knew it related to this. If I can make you more self-aware, you're less likely to engage in this. So we didn't frame it as bias, because I think too often when we frame things in conversations about bias, the wall goes up. They don't want to have the conversation because they think it's, you're just saying they're racist. What we do is we focus on belonging. How do we make every child feel like this is their space? How do we make this feel like this is the most welcoming place for our families, for our students? So when they walk in the doors, they feel good about being here. They feel like this is their spot. There's a question up here, Kelly. So that's where we focused on, was less about bias, more about belonging and creating an environment that's welcoming. So we spent a lot of time working on that. Yes.
My school has also done a lot of work on that with equity and SEL, and one shocking thing we found was we did a questionnaire asking students if they belong, and we've had kiddos from kids that started at kindergarten who are now in 4th grade who still did not see it as their school. So we as teachers have been very intentional. This is our classroom. These are our supplies, because especially when you work with challenging behaviors and things get destroyed, well, you ruin my things. And trying to make it more like this is our school, this is our community.
That's right, yeah, because we when we embarked on this, we did, and we still are doing, we do pre-post surveys, fall and spring, with staff and students. And it's also about their sense of belonging. What's interesting to see is that data, I didn't think we'd go down this hole, but to show that data is the students are differentially reporting lower rates based, and we break it out by demographics. And just as an aside, we also get their gender identity based on a self-report, so the students can self-identify as part of the survey. And they indicate, and what we found is those populations, as well as the traditionally minoritized populations, report lower senses of belonging. But what's interesting is you look at the teacher data, which asked about their relationship with their students. They're like, we're great, and so it's just interesting to see that disconnect, to see that there are people that feel like they're really connecting with kids, and the kids just aren't seeing it. Because the question is it an authentic connection? If I just say, hey, like your scarf, Erica. Well, that's a start, but are we connected now? No, and how often is that what people put in their mind as making a connection with a student? And so, well, I acknowledged them once. Does Erica feel like we're closer now because I acknowledged her scarf? It is a nice scarf, by the way. No. We can make a connection. He's got a Steeler fan here in the second row. He and I could be connected. We could. We'll have to talk later. I don't know what Matt Canada. Ooh. Anyway, but we could make that connection. That's something we could talk about. How often do we actually do that with our students? And that helps to mitigate some of this. Yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Thank you for being patient and remembering, because I almost didn't.
You mentioned, you asked the question earlier, if we know we're disproportionate, and we are, and we seem to be making intentional steps not to be. Would you have any suggestions on the next steps? Because over the last 2 years, we've had all this data. It shows that we're disproportionate, but it hasn't changed.
Yeah.
So would you have any suggestions on some next steps, even at a building level?
Sure. Are you talking discipline specifically? Or?
Discipline and over-representation or over-identification.
Okay. Well, one of the things I'll say, and that's what put some of these things up here in terms of practices, but one of the things that I know that we have intentionally done was we've changed the nature of suspensions. How many people feel like suspensions work great? Yeah, okay, good. Right, they don't, right? What is it? So you're going to go into solitary, we're going to put you in a room where you can stare at a wall, it doesn't work. So what we did is we changed it to be instructional. We took it and we said, what we're going to do is if you've done something that's inappropriate, we're going to pull you out for the day, but it's not going to be you sitting here staring at a wall while somebody sits there like barely reading the newspaper. It's going to be, you're going to work on skills. What got you suspended? So we're going to teach you a replacement skill. We're also going to work on how do you make amends? What do you do to give back to the community, the building? What are we going to do there? So we work with the students on that. Then we do vocational exploration with them. We do skill exploration. We actually have conversations with the kids about how they're doing. And what we find is that those kids who didn't feel like they belonged, oh, sorry, it's up here, or it was everybody, somewhere over here. The kids who don't feel like they belong, all of a sudden feel like there's somebody who actually cares about them, who's made a connection, because those are typically the most marginalized kids. So it tends to reduce the, and then we do the, which is the tougher part, it's going to sound funny to say, is then we go back and work with the teacher that made the referral in the first place, say, how do you welcome this kid back into your space? We recognize that they screwed up. They recognize that they screwed up. But we want to teach them, and we work with them on this. But you can't walk in like, the kid can't walk in and you can't be like this. That feel welcoming? Mm-mm. So you have to welcome them back in. And we have to, how do we repair that relationship? That's a big piece of it. And we also work with the kid. The last thing we do is we develop a reentry plan for them. You screwed up, right? Yeah, you're going to go back in here. Everybody, you know, or everybody saw this. So how do you walk back in there and go back into that space and pick up and move forward? What do we need to do? What do you need to say if somebody says something to you? So we actually work on script with them. What are you going to say if somebody says, well, you did blah, blah, blah? You need to have a response to that, which isn't you getting escalated. So what do we do? So we work with them. So then we meet with them. So that's the end of the day. And then first thing when they walk in the building in the morning, we're like, you remember what the plan was, right? Remember? You got it? Yeah. It's like, okay, good, go. So that way they can re-enter. And we find that our rates of suspension are dropping. Although it's funny because the kids are like, hey, can we come down? And the teachers were like, that was the funniest part. The teachers were all mad. They're not scared to go down. We changed it. It's called the SEL lab, the Social Emotional Learning Lab. And they were like, they don't care. They want to go down to the SEL lab. We're like, that's fine. I'm glad they feel connected somewhere. Good. Yeah, what we'll do is we'll tell them. We said, we'll schedule a time where you can come down. You don't have to mess up to come see these people. Yeah. Yeah, hope we got a couple here. And it's not easy, but but it works, and the kids feel more connected.
I love that. And my question is, who instructs that? Like, do you have a teacher?
Oh, right, there you go.
Para?
Everyone's like, amen, yes, what was that? Yeah. Yes. No, great question. No, it was, because actually it was clever. I give our principal, a lot of middle school principals, the first one who started it, and this is where we made the changes, and then we morphed up to our high school and our elementary level. We actually, when we had somebody retire, he changed the position into a SEL coach. 5 minutes? I thought you were just waving at me. SEL coach. Now that SEL coach is the one who runs that lab. So what they do, but they do it in partnership with a school counselor. So what we do is we have school counselors. I know everybody's like, oh, yeah. But no, what we did is we said, all right, here's the date. We only run the SEL lab on, we have a 6-day cycle, only being run on even days. So what we do is we assign the SEL coach and one of the counselors on day 2, SEL coach and another counselor on day 4, SEL and another coach on day 6. So that way the load is shared. Everybody's doing that because you have 2 adults there. They can monitor, they can work with the kids. There's no concerns about supervision. And you have multiple, and if you have more than one kid, you have multiple people, so they can be working on different things with different students. So it works really well. And it's actually resulted, as I said, in a reduction in the number of discipline referrals, and also was one of the keys to us understanding that that we had students who didn't feel like they belonged. That's where we first learned that, because we actually started doing the SEL lab pre-COVID. And that's where we started learning, like, oh my gosh, these kids, none of them feel like they belong. They don't feel like this is their place. And now they feel like they have a connection with a couple of people. And actually, I was involved. So and we have interns. We had our school psych interns. We're like, you guys can all help facilitate this. We get as many people involved as we can. But at base, it's a SEL coach and a school counselor who run those opportunities, rather than a substitute teacher or whomever you have just sort of managing the room. They also have to do some work. We're like, yeah, teachers, send some work along. We want them to do it, but that's not going to be their whole day. That's going to be a portion of their day, is trying to keep them up to speed and getting caught up on something they weren't. But it's not designed simply to be a full day, you're going to do classwork. I mean, we had students volunteering to help out with our local food program. That's what they did. That was one of the ways they gave back. One of the ways our PE teachers, the students had gym uniforms. You're doing laundry. You're helping out by giving back. That's part of it. The kids loved it. They actually felt like they were doing something for the school. They felt like they were engaged, that's awesome. I mean, that's part of it. Is they felt like they were contributing, giving back to the space to make it more of their own. These are just things to think about as we're moving through. What are your staff and resources? And it really is about how you're allocating your funds, how you're using your staff. You pay for what you value. I say that a lot because it drives the point home. Because you're thinking about what do you value. If you're thinking about how to do this work and everybody's solution is to harden your school, make it a more fortress-like place, is that welcoming? What are you paying for there? If you pay for what you value, you say, no, we want to invest in the people that can make the connections with the kids. That's what we want to spend our time and money on. Oh, you're just stretching? She's like, don't call on me. I'm merely stretching. Yeah, and so you think about that and think about how you're deploying your resources. Staff, you guys know, are your staffs used very efficiently all the time? No. Right. So if you actually sit down and have a conversation and redeploy and rethink how you're using your staff, imagine what you can do differently. Because I'll be honest, and this wasn't like a, hey, 5-minute conversation. When we came up with these solutions, like the SEO lab and all those things, those were multiple days of, no, we're meeting as a team for a full day out of the building so that we can be focused on doing this work and coming up with the best plan possible. And I give our administration a lot of credit because they're very supportive of it, and we're able to do that. But we recognize that it's not a in the hallway passing or a 1-hour meeting. How many 1-hour meetings actually are effective at the end of that? Just as you get going, like, okay, time's up, bye. Not unlike this session, right? You're like, okay, we got to get out of here. There are snacks outside. But it's really it's putting in investing that time and planning and having that process. I can't mention that enough. Is in that process, somebody needs to be checking the system. Somebody needs to be doing that, and it shouldn't just be one person. It should be a group of people. So that way, it isn't like, oh, Jason's a crank and he's malcontent. He's always giving us a hard time. While those things might be true about me, they are not. It shouldn't just be that. It should be a group of people who are checking that. Because we can always do better. That's the malcontent for me. I always tell school psychs, if you're not malcontent, you're not doing your job. You should always be malcontent because you can always do better. But I think that we could do that. So quickly wrapping up, because I literally am at time. One takeaway you have, you don't have to share it, but I want you to think about one thing you got out of today. We talked about questions. If you want to find me, I'm at the end here. I've done this with other people as well. Resources are at the back. Thank you so much for your time, your attention. I really appreciate it. Take care.